That's fantastic. Hi, everybody. It's good to be back. So what comes to mind for you when I bring up the book of Revelation in the Bible? Are there any images or symbols that are particularly stuck in your head about the book of Revelation? You can call them out. The rapture, okay. Strange, okay. What else? Suffering, yes. What was somebody in the back? The apocalypse, okay, yeah. Scary, okay. What about the four horsemen of the apocalypse? You heard of them? The beast and the mark of the beast. What's the mark of the beast? Anybody know that? 666. Oh yeah, don't let that be your phone number, right? The New Jerusalem. So we're not going to cover all of that today. This is a 6-week series. And I know that the preacher last Sunday preached on Revelation too, which was not planned, but that's great. Let's start with the rapture, though. The idea that the book of Revelation predicts a great 1,000-year tribulation upon the earth with tremendous suffering for all the people of the earth, of the world, except for the faithful Christians who get raptured up right before it happens. They get taken away and they don't have to deal with the 1,000 years of suffering. But many people are surprised to learn that this is not described anywhere in the book of Revelation. I thought it was too. And so I started looking into this and said, nope, it's actually not there. People are also surprised to learn that the first 1,700 years of Christianity, nobody believed in the rapture. It wasn't even a thing. It's a modern invention. In the 1800s, a British theologian named John Nelson Darby kind of made up the idea. There are a couple passages where he drew from. There's a passage in 1 Thessalonians and a couple things from the Gospels. But he had to fill in a lot of details to get to this sort of narrative of a rapture. And then in the 1900s, a study Bible was published called the Schofield Study Bible. And study Bibles have the text of the Bible, but then in the margins they have interpretive notes. And the Schofield Study Bible used Darby's understanding of the rapture throughout its notes. And the Schofield Study Bible was extremely popular among evangelical Christians in the 1900s in America. And so the idea of the rapture became known and accepted in evangelical circles, even though it's not really ever talked about in Revelation or specifically in the Bible. All that's to say that the rapture is this modern invention that is completely unnecessary to the Christian faith, and I think even unhelpful, and that it doesn't come from Revelation. So let's talk about some things that do come from Revelation. The word revelation is a translation of the Greek word apocalypsis, from which we get apocalypse, of course. And that word the root of that word is kalupto, the Greek word kalupto, which means a covering or a veil. So apocalypto is to remove a covering or to lift a veil. So the book of Revelation then is supposed to be revealing the true nature of reality that sits behind the reality we commonly see, the way you lift a veil on a person. And so you see a veil on a person, and you see kind of what's behind the veil, you lift the veil and you see clearly. That's what the book of Revelation is supposed to be doing. Ironically, it uses all of these completely wild and cryptic images and symbols that none of us understand in order to reveal the truth behind reality. So we're going to have to deal with that, right? We're going to have to deal with, that trying to understand Revelation is about trying to understand the spiritual forces that are at work beneath reality. Another important thing about Revelation for us to know as we begin this series is that it's not a book about predicting the future. And this is a hard one for people raised in the church or really in popular culture to understand and to get our heads around, especially since there are verses like in verse 1 that say, we are going to show what is to soon take place. And that certainly sounds like it's predicting the future. But we're probably reading those words, what must soon take place, from a future-oriented perspective of time that was not native to the text and the people in which it was written. So indulge me for a minute on a pretty esoteric discussion of time. Biblical scholars Wes Howard Brooke and Anthony Gweither, in their book about Revelation called Unveiling Empire, point out that our modern society today in America and in the West has a very future-focused orientation of time. We're always looking at what's coming next. We believe that we're in some sort of linear progression of history, and that we're thinking about things like improvement and progress and growth and expansion, that everything is moving toward the future. But again, this future focus of Revelation of our society was probably not endemic to the society in which Revelation was written. They probably had a much more, well, anything but future. They had a present orientation of time. They had a past orientation of time. If you look at the Old Testament, it talks about remember the acts of God and the mighty things that God has done for us, always looking back to the past. Or even a cyclical view of time, like the seasons. Like there's nothing new under the sun. What comes again, comes again, and it comes again, and that's just how time works. So our current focus on growth and improvement, on some projection of human history as a sequence of events, was not probably what they were thinking about when they wrote Revelation. Scholar Bruce Molina explains that the future in a present-oriented society is best understood at what is already in the process of becoming. That something is forthcoming or will soon take place when its later existence is guaranteed by its present antecedents. So in antiquity, change was understood as possible when what might happen was already understood as in the process of happening. Or to say this differently, the future in the society was built fundamentally on the template of the present. So what must soon take place refers not to a far-off sequence of events, but to what is in this moment emerging out of our current reality. Now, all of this is not just speculation about one really weird book of the Bible. It turns out that there's an entire genre of literature at the time called apocalyptic literature. And Revelation is just one example of the genre of apocalyptic literature. There's multiple examples in the Bible and outside the Bible. In the Bible, Daniel, Isaiah, and Ezekiel all have apocalyptic sections. The four Gospels three of those four Gospels have short apocalyptic sections. Jewish apocalyptic literature at the time includes 1st and 2nd Enoch, 4th Ezra, and the Apocalypse of Baruch. And Christian apocalyptic literature of the time included the Apocalypse of Peter and the Shepherd of Hermas. So this genre, this has all of these standard tropes within it, all of these images, like fantastic beasts and angels and periods of great suffering and coded language. The importance of all this is that when we read Revelation, it's not making this stuff up from nothing. It's using symbols and images that were a part of a language or a genre of talking about what was going on below the surface of reality. The last piece I want to bring in terms of introductory material of Revelation is that there's a broad consensus among biblical scholars that apocalyptic literature in general should be read as a critique of the abuses and the violence of the powerful. That's its intention, and the reason it uses symbols and coded language is because if you're going to critique the powerful, you have to hide what you're saying. So for Revelation, that critique was obviously of the Roman Empire. But because it uses symbolic language, it means that you can read Revelation as a critique of any empire, of any time, including our present empire. The American empire, the global capitalist corporate empire, whatever we call that. So that's all some introductory material on Revelation. Now, one of my goals for the summer and the fall is to shorten my sermons And so that was a long introduction for a short sermon. So I just have one point about Revelation to make, and maybe in about the same amount of words as the introduction. It's from chapter 1. The focus of chapter 1, even though there's a lot of stuff in there, the golden lampstands and the stars and everything, the real focus of chapter 1 is introducing Jesus Christ as one of those spiritual forces at work below the surface of our reality. So let me break down the name Jesus Christ first, because it kind of just slips off the tongue, and we can forget what it's really saying. And Jesus, the word Jesus does not necessarily mean Christ. And Christ is not necessarily synonymous with Jesus. And so it's important that we break those two apart before we combine them again. When we talk about Jesus, what we're talking about is the historical Jesus, the biblical person, Jesus of Nazareth, who walked around in Palestine, who had disciples, who taught people things, and who got crucified. When we talk about Christ, what we mean is a cosmic or divine essence or presence that permeates the universe, that's within each and every one of us, but then it is also within everything, the universal Christ, the cosmic Christ. When Christians talk about Jesus Christ, what they're hopefully referring to is the way that the historical Jesus embodied or revealed the divine essence of the universal Christ. And I say hopefully because some Christians, I think, wrongly believe that the historical Jesus was the only manifestation of Christ to ever exist. And I don't think that's true. In fact, Jesus' own words in Matthew 25 would contradict that idea. When he says, "Whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me," what he's saying is that the cosmic Christ is manifested in the poor, in the hungry, in the prisoner, and in the immigrant. Christ is not contained in the historical person of Jesus. In Revelation chapter 1, Christ is the one showing the author all of these wild visions, as well as being the subject of many of the visions. And we already discussed in chapter 1, verse 1, it's called Jesus Christ. But there are many other references with other names to Christ in chapter 1. In verse 5, the Christ is referred to as faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, and the ruler of the kings of the earth. In verse 7, the Christ is the one coming on the clouds, recognizable as the one who was pierced, connecting him again to Jesus and the abuse of empire. So there's this idea that Christ manifests in the victims of injustice and violence. In verse 13, the Christ is referred to as the human one. Now that's a word that we've changed in this church. The traditional is son of man. The Greek is hoousis tau anthropo, literally son of humanity. But in order to be gender inclusive, we change all of that to human one. But this description of the human one in this section, verse 13, is incredibly mythic and bizarre. Description is eyes like fire, feet of bronze, hair woolly and white as snow, and a voice like many waters. In verse 17, this mythic being, this Christ, speaks to us. I am the first and the last and the living one. I was dead, and see, I am alive forever and ever. I have the keys of death and Hades. So to pull this all together, in this book of Revelation, it shows us the reality below the surface of what we perceive as reality. What are the spiritual forces at work behind the veil? And we begin with a historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, who experienced the injustice and violence of the empire, refused to be cowed by that violence, remained true to his teachings of love even unto death, overcame that violence and death through resurrection, revealing in that resurrection a manifestation of the cosmic Christ. And just to make sure we don't miss the point, this power of Christ, this force, is the ruler of all the kings of the earth. So we are then invited to tap into this force that is stronger than violence, this power that is stronger than death, and this reality that is stronger than all the empires of the world. Theologian Walter Wink says that Revelation is inviting us to overcome not just the death-wielding empires of our day, but to confront and overcome the spiritual reality behind those empires, which he calls the domination system. The domination system includes all of the hierarchies of the world, like economic inequality, patriarchy, racism, ableism, nationalism, heterosexism. The empires themselves are manifestations of that fundamental domination spirit or domination system that humanity has been struggling to overcome since we invented the plow and started having food surpluses that we then competed with each other to control. So even as Jesus was pierced by the violence of the empire, even as he was killed, yet he still lives now as Christ. And even as the empires threaten us today with the violence of war and poverty, armed and anonymous police forces, discrimination of all kinds, even in the face of these threats, our humanity, as we know it, is more powerful and can overcome that domination system when we tap into that power that is beneath the surface. The resurrection of Jesus, then, the resurrection is not about believing in a doctrine. It's not about believing that a magical event happened 2,000 years ago in some tomb. The resurrection of Jesus is an overtly political proposition about the ultimate impotence of the violence of empires of this world and the key to bringing down those empires and that domination system. The empire thinks it can control people with threats of violence and threats of death. It thinks it can seduce us by convincing us that we are better than others and others are less than us. The empire thinks it can silence us with the arrest and detainment as we try to speak out. But if we have faith in the power of resurrection, not as a doctrine, but as a spiritual force, then we can have the courage to stand up against that violence, knowing that life will always rise and love will always be more powerful. The crucified and risen Christ will always be stronger than the violence that killed Jesus. The light will always outshine the darkness of empire's fear-mongering. Our souls, our spirits, our hearts, and our love will always be more powerful than the division and hate that empire attempts to sow among us. Whatever headlines that we read, whatever vile words that come from our leaders, whatever violence they threaten, we must ground ourselves in the greater reality below the surface in which Christ is greater than any king of this earth, in which faith conquers fear, and in which love overcomes hate. This book is not about predicting a far-off future. It's about shaping an emerging reality by pulling back the veil of the empire's bravado and exposing the impotence of the domination system. And we do that when we claim the divine power that we have among us and within us that is just below the surface. Amen.